I'm Maurice Sarchi. I'd like to welcome you all. It's wonderful to see this huge space completely full. I can't see an empty chair. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to introduce Michael right now, but I want to say something before I do. Lady Joseph, who has hardly ever missed these lectures, is not well, and therefore she's not here. Her daughters Anna and Emma are here, and also her grandchildren, Sam, Alexander, Nicholas, and Anthony, who I'm very happy to say is just about to start work experience at the CPS. Would you join me in sending Lady Joseph the best wishes from everyone here? If you will all allow me, I'm going to address these remarks to the grandchildren. May I do that? Your grandfather is a great man. That title is much overused and rarely deserved. Isaiah Berlin, one of the great thinkers of our time, defined what it was, whether there was such a thing as the great man theory of history, whether such people have ever existed, and what was required in order to deserve the title, a great man. He set out the qualifications. He said this means an individual who, acting alone or almost single-handed, permanently alters the outlook and values of a significant number of human beings. It means a man or a woman who has a flat refusal to accept the status quo, a romantic belief in man's ability to change the world by an act of will. Your grandfather deserves the title. He and Margaret Thatcher, as we all know, developed all the winning arguments of our time, which Tim just described. Free markets, a small state, low tax, independence, individuality, self-determination. As Tim also said, so far as the centre ground is concerned, on which all political activity now seems to take place, their view was that if the centre ground was over there, the thing to do was not to go and walk over there. That would not be the correct thing to do. The correct thing to do would be to bring the centre ground from there to where we're standing. And this is exactly what the Centre for Policy Studies, in great respect and memory for Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph, try to do. In particular, I'd like to point out to you that they were not frightened by the connection between freedom and money. Keith Joseph said national solvency is not an objective. It's the sine qua non for the achievement of any objectives. So tonight, in his honour, we have the honour of one of the great men of the present government, who I have known well for many years. He's regularly spoken of, sensibly, as a Prime Minister in waiting. As you hear his brilliant lecture, you're going to reflect on the question of how did Michael Gove do it? How did he get to rise up to the top like this? And I can now reveal his secret. He copied Keith Joseph. Because Keith Joseph, when he was our illustrious predecessor at the CPS, knew that what he had to do in order to achieve his aims, just as Michael has to do now, and achieve something of a revolution, in order to do that, he had to change the weather. He had to change the academic climate of opinion. And I've seen how he did it. And he did it by writing handwritten letters to people, which said, I have seen, heard, read your article, book, interview, speech, and I am very interested in what you say. Would you do me the honour of coming to lunch one day to discuss your ideas further? Which is exactly what he did. Michael and I, years ago, when we were children, had a very similar concept, and we invited the grand personnage of the age to dinners, from which we learned rather a lot, which we've tried to put into effect. But now, this little piece of history means that I have been able, in an ironic twist of fate, to write to Michael saying, I have seen, heard, read your speech, article, book, etc. would you do me the honour of giving the Keith Joseph Memorial Lecture for the Centre for Policy Studies in 2013? To which Michael replied immediately, yes. And it is indeed a great honour to have one of the stars of the government here for this lecture, and I assure you, you're in for a great treat. Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Maurice. It's a great honour to be here, and it's particularly poignant to have heard those words of Margaret Thatcher and to have heard her voice here in the Guildhall just weeks after the nation united to mourn her passing. Almost inexpressibly moving to hear that voice echoing around this hall. It's also, for me, a great honour to have been invited to deliver this lecture and also to have been introduced in that way by Maurice. I don't know whether or not I've consciously imitated Keith Joseph, but I have consciously imitated Maurice. I can't emulate his clarity of thought. I cannot replicate his intelligence, and I cannot in any way copy the swathe that he has cut through corporate Britain. But what I can do is wear the same set of spectacles as he has. And in that sense, it is an homage to much that Maurice has achieved. In the autumn of 1984, Sir Keith Joseph faced one of the most difficult political battles of his ministerial life. He was trying to reform the financing of higher education by asking for a higher contribution from middle-class students and their families. And he'd already encountered entrenched opposition from the defenders of privilege within his own party. He was wrestling with this question late into the evening of Thursday, the 12th of October, 1984, and he worked on the submissions in his ministerial red box into the early hours of the Friday, when an IRA terrorist bomb exploded. It brought death and destruction to the Grand Hotel in Brighton, where the cabinet was staying for the Conservative Party conference. Sir Keith, alone among the ministers in the hotel, had the presence of mind to bring his red box with him as he sought to make it to safety from the hotel wreckage. And as he descended the fire escape, he had but one thought in his mind. He was agitated and preoccupied, repeating himself, according to an eyewitness. "How is she?" he asked. "How is she? How is she?" According to his biographer Morrison Halcrow, his sang-froid returned only when the police assured him that she was safe. The she, of course, was Margaret Thatcher, the politician he admired more than any and who admired him in equal measure. But this story tells us so much more than just about the bond between these two reformers. In a way, it sums up what was so special about Sir Keith. His first concern throughout his life was always others. He was always, even in a crisis, a good deal more practical than those who thought that his self-effacement was a sign of unworldliness. And his devotion to work in the service of others, hard intellectual effort in pursuit of fairness and opportunity, made him a special politician. He was always an idealist with a sense of vocation, never a careerist with an instinct for power. And his achievements, of course, as that story reminds us, can never be separated from the achievements of the woman whom he helped into number 10 and whose course in government he, more than anyone, helped to set. So it's a real honour to be invited to give a lecture in Sir Keith Joseph's honour. And it's a particular honour to be invited by the Centre for Policy Studies, the think tank that he created and which more than any other organisation laid the intellectual foundations for this nation's revival in the 1980s. It's a pleasure also to be able to give this lecture in the Guildhall. Sir Keith was the son of a Lord Mayor, an alderman himself of the City of London, and he took for his title in the House of Lords the place he represented on the City Corporation, Portsoken, the ward where the city meets the East End. And it's a pleasure, not just because the surroundings here are sumptuous and the audience august, but also because it gives me a chance to affirm my admiration here for the principles of the CPS and the achievements of the City of London. The Centre for Policy Studies has argued consistently and bravely for 39 years for limited government, lower taxation, greater personal freedom, educational excellence, greater social mobility, and national revival. It's been led by men and women of principle and passion, and it's been my privilege to learn from all of them. Hugh Thomas, Tessa Keswick, Norman Blackwell, Maurice Saatchi, and Jenny Nicholson and Tim Knox. And I look forward to the CPS playing an even bigger role in the nation's political life in the decades to come. We need to make the case for limited government and greater individual opportunity more clearly than ever now. For the CPS, I suspect, a new lease of life truly will begin at the age of 40. The City of London is an even more venerable institution, but like the CPS, it is one that we need more than ever now. It's become fashionable to criticise the city and its workers, to deprecate bankers and to bash banks, to look askance at financial services and to look down on those whose trade is in money. And certainly, given the behaviour of a number of egregiously greedy and foolishly reckless individuals, there had to be a change of culture, attitude and regulation in the city. That's why George Osborne is introducing comprehensive banking reform, not to punish the city, but to protect an institution tarnished by a series of terrible errors. But we would be making a grave historic error if we were to allow determination to cleanse the stables to harden into a prejudice against those individuals and institutions that we need to win in the global race. Britain's financial services are a world-leading industry. They're a major generator of growth, a significant earner of exports, a massive employer of our citizens, and a huge contributor to the exchequer. The efficient allocation of capital, the smoothing of access to debt, the prudent investment of savings, the skillful management of risk. They're all as necessary to growth in manufacturing and in services as a skilled workforce and a modern infrastructure. Britain's industrial revolution in the 19th century depended on the financial innovation of the preceding 100 years or so. The creation of the Bank of England in the first place, modern company structures, new methods of debt finance. That is why we have to resist clumsy and ill-thought-out interventions from the EU and from the Labour Party, which would impair the power of the city to innovate, to attract talent, and to generate wealth and opportunity for everyone in our nation. But important, vital as wealth creation is, that's not my subject tonight. Nor was it the motive force for Sir Keith's political career. Sir Keith entered politics for the noblest of reasons. As Morrison Halcrow records, he belonged to the honourable tradition of politicians whose starting point was improving the social conditions of the poor. As a schoolboy, it was the plight of the disadvantaged that moved his heart. Sir Keith used to exasperate his family by purloining food from the family breakfast table, not to eat later, but to share with the homeless. As an undergraduate, he joined a Quaker group which worked with the unemployed, and he dedicated his time to helping the citizens of a Yorkshire mining community. They were not the only comrades with whom he made common cause. He also helped a group of Republican refugees fleeing from Franco's Spain when they found refuge in England. And after his war service, Sir Keith did not gravitate towards power or riches. He devoted himself to social and charitable work in the East End. He worked with community leaders to help alleviate poverty and to support those with physical disabilities. He joined the Howard League for Penal Reform. He became chairman of a Nuffield Foundation on Senility, as the debilitating condition of Alzheimer's was then termed, as well as throwing himself into the work of the National Council for Carers. He was, throughout his entire career, concerned with the lives of those whom others overlooked. And he was anxious that they should enjoy the same rights and privileges, dignity and respect open to those who were more fortunate. And that sometimes meant that a certain naivety, or as I prefer to think of it, idealism, crept in. In his earliest years as a Member of Parliament for Leeds North East, he was concerned about the diet of constituents in an old folks' home in the city at that time. Why, he wondered, must their single hot meal of the day be just fish and chips? Why could they not enjoy, he suggested, a decent boeuf bourguignon? There was, of course, in these suggestions, an innocence about how they might be received. But it was not the innocence of the ingenue, as Margaret Thatcher reminded us. It was the innocence of one who wonders, with a clarifying idealism, why we as a society settle for misery and mediocrity when sweetness and light are there, if we fight for them. And it is that spirit, the determination to ensure that all our citizens have the chance to live fulfilled lives, which I think is the memory of Sir Keith most worth preserving. And that is why it is the animating mission of the Conservative Party in government. We're fighting now to make opportunity more equal, to ensure that every citizen enjoys the dignity, autonomy and freedom which allow them to become truly fulfilled. Sir Keith devoted himself to a range of different causes and crusades during his time in government, and I want to consider each of them tonight. In his ministerial career, he was involved with the reform of healthcare, the healing of the welfare system, the expansion of home ownership, and of course, radical steps to improve state education. It's almost uncanny, but in a way inspiring, that the principal energies of Conservatives in government now are committed to all those causes. We are, as Sir Keith was, dedicated to making our society fairer, more open, and more civilised. Nowhere is the drive to ensure that every citizen is treated with dignity and fairness being more zealously pursued than in the Department of Health. My colleague Jeremy Hunt leads a dedicated team of ministers whose driving concern is improving the care afforded to the most vulnerable in our society. Now, debates on the future of the NHS can sometimes appear to descend into raucous spending auctions or arguments between rival teams of management consultants. And there are understandable reasons for that. Money and management matter in healthcare. That's why it's so reassuring that David Cameron has, alone among party leaders, both promised and delivered absolute protection for health spending. And that is why we all owe a debt to Andrew Lansley for bravely and presciently transforming the organisational structure of the NHS to equip it for massive demographic and cost pressures. And already we can see the benefits of both sets of decisions. Investment in the NHS by Conservatives in England is leading to improved outcomes for patients, while declining health spending in Labour-controlled Wales is leading to poorer outcomes. And those trends have been reinforced by the decision to reform provision in England, which Wales declined to implement. I know from the doctors that I talk to in my own constituency how much better they feel that they can discharge their duties now that Andrew Lansley's reforms are in place. They are treating more patients more quickly. They can more effectively guarantee their comfort and freedom from infection, and they can more rapidly secure the specialist attention they need for more complex conditions. So getting the cash and the shape of these new commissioning groups right matters. But what matters even more, and what Jeremy exemplifies, is a determination to transform the NHS so it overcomes its inherited bureaucratic weaknesses and becomes, at every level, a personal service for patients. The horror of what happened in Mid-Staffordshire under the last government underlines what can happen when the personal care and the respect that we owe to every human being are forgotten. Patients succumbing to dehydration, lying in their own waste, dying in pain and squalor, with no one they could love or trust by their side. It's a heart-rending story, as well as a terrible reproach to those who were in charge at that time. And what makes the situation all the more intolerable is that we've been here before. When Sir Keith Joseph took over as Secretary of State for Health and Social Services in 1970, as his biographer records, there had been horrific stories about conditions sometimes reaching neglect and downright criminal cruelty in hospitals for the old and mentally ill. Sir Keith typically was driven by a desire to help those all too easily and tragically overlooked, not just the old and those with mental illness, but also those with chronic and immensely painful conditions, which were not considered priorities because they lacked the excitement and drama of medical areas which were the subject of cutting-edge research. Sir Keith lamented the tendency of some doctors at the time to be remarkably selective in choosing the ills that they consider worthy of treatment, and he described the reports of poor care that he regularly received as a running torment. The same passion to protect the interests of the overlooked and underserved in our society is driving Jeremy's approach to the NHS. His introduction of the Friends and Family Test for the quality of patient care will ensure that more attention is paid to ensuring that every patient is treated with dignity. His overhaul of the Care Quality Commission, so it operates in a way explicitly modelled on the rigorous school inspections of Ofsted, will further drive up standards. And Jeremy's insistence that nursing training once more emphasises the quality of personal care as essential to the work of healing will help the profession bring relief from pain and greater comfort to all who suffer. Jeremy is operating squarely in Sir Keith's tradition, as a minister driven by a personal commitment and a strong sense of moral purpose to want to reduce human suffering. And so is another of my Conservative cabinet colleagues, Ian Duncan-Smith. Ian's welfare reforms are the culmination of a struggle begun by Sir Keith when, as Secretary of State for Health and Social Services, he declared war on poverty. Sir Keith was preoccupied throughout his government career by what he termed the cycle of deprivation. His biographer explained the impetus for reform in the context of Sir Keith's consistent belief that properly targeted action could help those in our society who were most in need. His action was about the quality of life and how that quality was being denied to innocent sufferers, Morrison Halcrow writes. It was about unnecessary suffering passed on from parents with problems to children who perpetuated those problems. Sir Keith felt stimulated by it as a challenge to the welfare state, a challenge not only to break the cycle of deprivation, but also to arouse the public conscience. Sir Keith himself argued, deprivation takes many forms and they interact. It shows itself in poverty, in emotional impoverishment, in personality disorder, in poor educational attainment, in depression and despair. When a child is deprived of love and guidance, he is deprived of that which is most likely to lead to stability and maturity. The passion Sir Keith brought to the fight against deprivation, how rarely, even today we hear politicians talk of love, was matched, as one would expect, by an unsparing intellectual honesty about the complexity of the problem that society faced. Deprivation, he realized, was not just about material poverty. It was also about poverty of ambition, poor personal relationships, poor schools, a deficit of love and support, and a lack in the family home of structure and order. One of the most tragic and least remarked on failures of the left, with certain honourable exceptions, has been its reluctance to see deprivation as anything other than just mechanistically material. The last government's anti-poverty strategy relied overly on income transfers, without any feel for or passion towards eradicating the factors which trapped individuals in deprivation in the first place. Of course money matters when fighting poverty, but if you simply transfer wealth without addressing the reasons why individuals find themselves in the cycle of deprivation, then you only ever alleviate the symptoms. You never remove the causes. That's why the changes that Ian has introduced matter so much. Few people have worked so hard to understand how individuals become trapped in poverty. The work he led at the Centre for Social Justice has transformed the debate. The CSJ has directed new and welcome attention on the contribution that addiction and substance abuse among adults make on children's life chances. It's explored how poor parenting, in particular domestic violence, can impair children's cognitive development. It's considered how poorly the care system looks after so many children and young people in desperate need. And it analysed the factors drawing disadvantaged young people into criminality and addiction. And of course, the CSJ also outlined how important it is to give meaning and structure through work to the lives of young people. And in office, Ian's work has been transformative already. The welfare system is being reformed, not to save money, but to save lives. Instead of incentives for idleness and a culture of dependency, there are powerful incentives to work, to provide for others, to achieve fulfilment. As the heroic Labour MP, Simon Danczuk, himself an SKP from the cycle of deprivation, has pointed out, people can achieve amazing things through their own work. Few have ever achieved anything through dependence on the state. And alongside Ian's reforms to support people into work, he's led, through the Cabinet's Social Justice Committee, a wider programme of reform to help break the cycle of deprivation. We've established an early intervention foundation, which is looking at robust research into the policies which genuinely help vulnerable young children. We've strengthened a new Child Poverty and Social Mobility Commission and introduced policies to improve the lives of children who are at risk of neglect. Across Cabinet, the cause of social justice, championed by Ian, is embedded in every policy area. At the Home Office, Theresa May has put the elimination of domestic violence and violence directed towards women and girls at the heart of radical crime prevention measures. She's improving how we investigate cases where children are exposed to harm and abuse. And she's also bringing leadership to the coordination of all the agencies which are charged with the prevention of the horrific crime of child exploitation. She's also developed a more robust set of policies than ever before to deal with gang violence, drug abuse, and drug trafficking. And in the Queen's speech, there are new measures to tackle the antisocial behaviour which blights lives in many of our most disadvantaged areas. I believe that Theresa's programme of reform is the most progressive to come from the Home Office since the 60s. And it's matched by an equally progressive approach from the Ministry of Justice, where Chris Grayling is putting education and rehabilitation at the heart of penal policy, ensuring that young offenders learn the skills they need to reintegrate into society. And he's reforming probation services to fit them more closely to the needs of ex-prisoners who want a better life. Work in all these areas is, by definition, the very opposite of glamorous. So it is perhaps unsurprising that so much of it goes unreported. But it's the work of Conservatives and government to tackle deprivation, which is at the heart of David Cameron's mission for our party. And it's also central to everything that we do at the Department for Education. We've extended the number of hours that young children spend in education before they attend school. We've freed social workers from overweening bureaucracy, so they're better able to intervene in those families where children are at risk of horrific abuse and neglect. We have also acted to ensure that when children are taken into care, they're better protected and prepared for the future. If children are in residential care, information is now shared, it wasn't before, to ensure that they are protected from predatory adults or other dangers. And we also ensure that the quality of these children's education is better. Every child in care is given additional money to improve their schooling through the pupil premium. And every local authority is required to appoint a responsible adult, a virtual school head, to guarantee that children in care receive the attention they need. And we're also guaranteeing, through the Junior ISA scheme, that when children do leave institutional care, they have savings to help them through adult life. At the same time, we are making it easier for those children who are in care to find stable and loving homes by making adoption quicker, fairer, and more efficient. The courts and local authorities have been instructed to work together to reduce the time that children in care spend waiting before they're placed with adoptive families. And the rules which prevented children from black and minority ethnic backgrounds finding adoptive parents as quickly as other children have been reformed. We've also written into law the same rights for adoptive parents as other parents, so they can enjoy parental leave and subsequent support, so that children who are adopted can be given love and stability. All this, and a programme of social work reform, which includes overhauling politically correct training, getting more top graduates into the profession, and putting the practice onto an even more rigorous footing. Social workers spend their lives with those whose lives are the most fragile and whose voices most faint in our society. They do wonderful work. Far too often they're not given the credit they deserve. So this government, following the lead set by the Prime Minister, wants to change that by making sure that those public servants who work with the most vulnerable people are society's most valued professionals. I believe the changes that we're making to child protection, the care system, and social work practice will ensure that thousands more at last escape the cycle of deprivation, which so concerns Sir Keith. Ensuring that individuals can free themselves from dependency and hopelessness was, of course, a preoccupation of Sir Keith's that governed his ministerial life. But it also permeated his life outside politics. Out of office, he was an activist director of the family construction firm Gove. And when in government, including a period as housing minister, he was a dedicated proponent of wider home ownership. Sir Keith understood instinctively, as Margaret Thatcher did, that wanting to own your own home was as natural an instinct for the British as wanting to complain about the weather or laugh at politicians. And the home-owning instinct was not just an aspect of our national character, it was a promoter of other virtues. Owning your own home makes it easier to bring up the next generation in security. It insulates you from economic vicissitudes. It enables you to pass on capital to your children. Home owners have an interest in economic prudence. They want low interest rates. They therefore support the policies which promote low inflation rates and sound money. Homeowners know in their hearts what Locke articulated in his treatises on government. Property ownership is the foundation of a free society. Indeed, the more dispersed the ownership of property in any society, the more resilient it will be against assaults on liberty. When Sir Keith was housing minister, he described himself as a more man. He wanted more homes for more people more quickly, which is admirable. But for what it's worth, I would add one caveat. I believe that we cannot think of our built environment without thinking of beauty. Many of the most beautiful vistas in the United Kingdom are beautiful because of building. Whether it's Chatsworth, or the Nash Terraces of Regent's Park, Edinburgh's Newtown, or Salisbury Cathedral, the man-made environment is as capable of inspiring awe as anything in nature. So when we think of new building, we should not think only of losing some undeveloped land. We should also think of the potential to create something of grace and beauty, to ravish the eye and lift up the soul. That too few modern buildings can aspire to real beauty is, how can I put this, a challenge to the architectural profession. But it's not an argument against development per se. As Charles Moore has said, if you fear that there are too many houses built in the countryside, which ones would you pull down? Easton Neston, Cliveden, Wadston, the sandstone homes of Stamford, or the limestone cottages of Berwick St John? We've built homes of transcendent beauty in the past. We can do so again. And we do, in the spirit of Sir Keith, need more, many more of them. For generations now, we've built too few homes, and the constricted supply has contributed to the growth and bursting of property bubbles. Because we've not had an equilibrium between housing demand and supply, we've not had a proper housing market. Over time, prices have risen faster than earnings, at such a rate that the proportion of first-time buyers who do not rely on financial assistance from others, usually the bank of mum and dad, has fallen from 69% in 2005 to 34% in 2011. Increasingly, access to home ownership has become the preserve of those with family wealth. And many of the homes which have been built in the last 2 decades have been unnecessarily cramped, among the smallest in Europe, making it more difficult to raise and support your own family. But now, thanks to the political courage and policy clarity of Eric Pickles, Greg Clark and Nick Bowles, things are changing. Local plans are being drawn up in consultation with local communities, which free up more land for development in a way which respects environmental concerns, but also meets our desperate need for new housing. These planning reforms have not been without their critics, but no one who believes in social mobility, in aspiration, in pro-family policies, in thrift and in freedom can be anything other than delighted by the release of more land for more house building. Hand in hand with planning reform, the Chancellor's also helped free up the credit market to ensure that first-time buyers can get access to the finance they need in a more sustainable way. And an expansion of shared equity schemes has made it easier for those on modest incomes to get on the property ladder. It's a perhaps forgotten feature of Sir Keith Joseph's political past that he was actually an admirer of Harold Macmillan, not least because of Macmillan's success in spreading home ownership. And Sir Keith helped carry on that tradition, as of course, most magnificently, did Margaret Thatcher. It is heartening that after a period of Labour government, when the historic trend towards increasing home ownership went into reverse, that at last we're extending property ownership once more. It confirms the Conservatives as the party which helps every individual to live a life more fulfilled. But critical as extending home ownership must be in any drive to make opportunity more equal, nothing, I believe, is as important as extending access to high-quality education. The ministerial job to which Sir Keith devoted the lion's share of his time in government was Education Secretary. Looking back to his time in that office from my position now is to be humbled by what he achieved against the odds. Schools and those who run them are supposed to act in loco parentis. But before Sir Keith became Education Secretary, the occupant of the office acted more like a sugar daddy than a responsible parent. His or her job was to fight for a larger and larger budget from the Exchequer and then hand it over to local authorities so they could do as they wished. Sir Keith was the first Education Secretary to respond effectively to the concerns about the quality of England's schools in the post-war world, which had inspired Jim Callaghan's famous Ruskin speech. Sir Keith believed that there needed to be a greater element of parental choice in education to drive up standards. He believed that choice needed to be informed, so he published inspectors' reports which had hitherto been restricted, and he sought above all to set higher aspirations for all students, especially the poorest. As his biographer records, the emphasis now was on what the department could do to raise the quality of education. To use the metaphor that floated around in the world at this time, he began to push open the door to the secret garden, where every previous education minister had been reluctant to walk. The secret garden was the content of education. At the time Sir Keith began to push open that door, there were all too many on the other side trying to bar his way. For the trade unions and local authorities, scrutiny of what was taught and how schools performed was profoundly unwelcome because the quality was so poor. But the easing open of that door has now allowed parents and taxpayers to see just what is being delivered in their name. From the decision to publish inspection reports taken more than 20 years ago, to decisions that this government has taken to publish much more data than ever before on school performance, especially the performance of disadvantaged pupils, greater transparency has helped to drive up standards and to make opportunity more equal. And it was the performance of disadvantaged pupils which preoccupied Sir Keith most of all during his time in the Department for Education. The forgotten 40%, who constituted what became known as the tail, the underachievers concentrated in areas of disadvantage, were always his greatest concern, as they are mine. And that's why so much of the department's work now is concentrated on helping to eliminate the achievement gap, which still exists between children from poorer homes and their better-off peers. England is one of the most unequal nations in the developed world in terms of educational achievement. Just 5 schools, 4 independent, Eton, Westminster, St Paul's Boys and St Paul's Girls, plus 1 sixth form college, Hills Road in Cambridge, get more students into Oxbridge than 2,000 state schools and colleges put together. More boys get to Oxbridge from Eton alone than from the entire cohort of children, 100,000 or so, eligible every year for free school meals. Our reforms are explicitly targeted at ending this scandal. We're spending £2.5 billion, the pupil premium, targeted on the poorest children. Every school is held accountable for that money. They have to show that it is helping to eliminate that achievement gap. We've set up an independent foundation at arm's length from government, run by the philanthropic charity, the Sutton Trust, to fund research into the teaching methods which will help close that attainment gap. We're funding 3 times as many idealistic young graduates to enter the fantastic charity Teach First. It only recruits in our best universities, and only those with outstanding degrees and real leadership potential are permitted to join. The charity then deploys them to teach in areas of disadvantage. Already they're having a dramatic effect, and thanks to increased funding from this government, Teach First are expanding their reach into more schools across more areas of the country than ever before. We're also ensuring that more teacher training takes place in schools rather than teacher training colleges, so that instead of the rigid, pickled, politically correct orthodoxy of the past, new teacher trainees are exposed to the high-quality practice at the chalk face of our very best teachers. And changes that we're also making to rigid pay structures will now allow heads to pay good teachers more. Schools in poorer areas can use this flexibility, alongside the additional money which comes from the pupil premium, to recruit and retain the best teachers for the most disadvantaged communities. And we've also increased the number of underperforming schools which have been taken out of local authority control. More than 200 of the weakest primaries in the country are now sponsored academies. And overall, more than 3,000 schools in this country now enjoy academy status. Some of the schools, like Downhills Primary in Tottenham, were the target of a vigorous campaign from union militants who were determined to prevent students benefiting from higher standards, academic excellence and academy sponsorship. But the school and its students are now flourishing as part of the superlative academy chain run by Lord Harris of Peckham and Sir Dan Moynihan. More and more high-performing schools are taking weaker schools in disadvantaged areas under their wing. And at the same time, more teachers, parents and philanthropists are taking advantage of our reforms to start up wholly new schools, free schools, independent schools in the state sector, all of them overwhelmingly in areas of real need. And also we're making changes to our national curriculum and our examination system to reinforce this dynamic. We want to entrench a culture of higher standards for all and to clear more space in the school year for proper teaching rather than repetitive testing. I would hope that these changes might have commended themselves to Sir Keith had we been blessed enough to have him still around to see them. As his biographer stated, summing up his career, Lord Joseph threw himself powerfully into the cause of helping the underprivileged as Education Secretary, and he bore the scars for it, inflicted collectively by the Teachers' Union, among others. But his work there provides a marker for his party when it should try to work out a modern social philosophy. 20 years on, thanks to the leadership shown by David Cameron, our party does have a modern social philosophy, and it is imbued by the spirit of Sir Keith's great work. It is consciously in the tradition of compassionate conservatism that he incarnated. That's why I believe the best memorial that all of us can erect to him is a society in which opportunity is more equal, the needs of the most vulnerable are our first priority, and the greatest fulfillment that any of us can have is in service to others. Thank you. One of the principal features of the Centre for Policy Studies is that no matter how excellent its pamphlets or arguments, nothing is as excellent as the quality of the refreshment that it provides to its loyal supporters. And I've no wish to keep you away from those refreshments and the chance to catch up with old friends and make new ones any longer than is necessary. But I believe that it's a tradition, Maurice, after every lecture, for the lecturer to allow anyone who wishes to ask a question, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anyone might have here this evening.
And in line with the tradition, I think everyone would be very grateful if you stand up and say your name and any organisation you represent. Please go ahead. In the corridor here on the left.
I wanted to ask you, my background was in the city, with invisible earnings being a great cause. One of the other invisible earnings which Britain is very famous for is education. And it's interesting that in your war against excessive immigration, you've lumped students with immigrants. And there are several colleges which are having great difficulty at the moment in getting visas for the students who are applying for the courses. We've set up the British College in Kathmandu, which is taking students who don't have to come to England, but we make a contribution to the invisible earnings. But I believe that the war on immigrants has cost education about £2 billion of earnings for the British economy. I wonder what you're doing from your office to try and get that right.
Well, I'm a strong supporter of the action that Theresa May has taken to reduce net migration, and I think it's underappreciated that as a result of the changes that she's introduced, net migration has reduced by a third, and I think that sending a clear signal that we have more control over our borders enables us to secure all the benefits that managed migration can bring. And you're absolutely right. We want to make sure that high-quality education institutions can welcome people from abroad, that they can learn here and that we can learn from them, in the same way as enterprising individuals who want to contribute to our economy and our culture are always welcome here. But we know that some of those routes were abused, sometimes grievously, in the past. And I also know from the work that Theresa has done that the diminution in the number of students tends to have been to those institutions which were very poorly regulated, and that actually high-quality institutions, including our best universities, have recorded an increase in the number of students coming from abroad. So high-quality institutions have nothing to fear, but routes which were abused in the past have properly been corrected, and I think that's the right approach.
There's a microphone coming. Yes, just on the left there.
Do you ever envisage a future scenario?
Would you say your name, please?
Yeah, Bhaskar Mitra, I'm a CPS associate. Do you ever envisage a future scenario when the Tories would be forced, as a result of political circumstances, to form coalition with UKIP? And do you think if that happens, it'll be a desirable outcome?
I was told recently that it was always a bad idea to answer hypothetical questions. But let me say this. I don't think the Conservative Party should form a coalition with anyone. We're in one at the moment. We have to make the best of it. It's a sign of character how you cope when you're thrown into adverse circumstances. And I think it's shown David Cameron's character to be outstanding in that he's managed to preserve Conservative principles and advance Conservative policies while building a unified government in order to deal with our deficit. I actually think at the next election that the admiration that people have for the way in which David and George have led us through these immensely difficult times will result in a Conservative majority. I think the recent tentative but promising economic news reinforces the fact that they, unlike, for example, the leaders in France and some other countries, have taken the right tough decisions. So I'm absolutely confident that the situation need not arise. So if it is a cause of sleepless nights for you, can I assure you that you can sleep well tonight, safe in the knowledge that when you wake up in the spring and summer of 2015, it will be to see David Cameron re-elected at the head of a majority Conservative government.
On the right here.
Hello, Anthony Schofield, a member of the CPS. Surely, Mr. Gove, it's getting dangerous to go out nowadays. Bits of the Conservative Party are falling down on top of us, rather like the inhabitants of Pompeii. I mean, look what's happened in South Shields. And a complete transfer of the Conservative vote to UKIP. Look what's happening throughout the north of England. The party's in desperate states. Membership is falling. Even you talk about immigration. I notice the report is that most jobs last year were taken by workers born outside the UK. Now it seems to me that in marginal seats, the next election, people are going to be considering voting Tory or UKIP. And UKIP has already got an advantage, a big advantage over the Conservatives, in that it reaches into people who would not ever dream of voting Conservative. So in my opinion, the situation is quite desperate. And the Tory party needs to immediately pledge that it will start work to leave the EU and also pledge to stop mass immigration.
It's certainly the case that if your party fails to do well in any election, you have to learn appropriate lessons. But I think it's a misunderstanding of the electoral geography of this country to say that Conservatives aren't doing well in the north and in northern areas which are not the leafy rolling wolds and dales. Carlisle is a manufacturing centre, proud city, urban seat. We won it at the last general election with a superb candidate, John Stevenson. Happens to be an Aberdonian like myself, but he's a great man. We won that, and we haven't won it since, I think, the 1950s or the 1960s. So it's wrong to look at any one seat like South Shields at a time when the government is taking unpopular decisions and construe from that a trend about what might happen at the next election. Let's remember that there were seats in the north of England that we didn't win between the period of 1979 and 1983 that we went on to win in 1983. Just months before the 1983 general election, we lost Darlington. I think it's important that we don't succumb to a council of despair. I think it's important that we look in context at those many groups who, and you suggest that there are some people who would never vote Conservative. There are many, many people who would never vote UKIP. And we've got to make sure that they can feel at home in a Conservative party which is welcoming and inclusive. I think people know that I have views on the European Union, but I think it's important that we also recognise that David Cameron is providing a greater degree of clarity on policy and leadership in negotiation than any previous leader. No other Prime Minister has vetoed an EU treaty. No other Prime Minister has been as effective in putting Britain's interest first and forging negotiations. So I'm confident at the time of the next election that from Tyneside to Tintagel, people will recognise that he deserves to be re-elected with an increased majority.
I think in the same sort of place on the right, though.
Hi, my name is Natasha Graham. I work at Bellenden. We're a public affairs and corporate communications consultancy, and I specialise in education policy. I'm interested, since we're at the Centre for Policy Studies, or it's a CPS event, given the values of kind of market entry, competition, all of those kind of themes, is that something that you think we'll see increasingly entering the education system? Firstly, do you think the private sector entering the education system, do you think it's still attractive for private business? Do you think there's profit to be made there? And also, do you think it's something that you'll be supporting over the next couple of years, and also if you were to come in for another term?
Well, I think the striking thing is that the best schools in this country at the moment, whether they're in the independent fee-paying sector or in the state sector, are not profit-seeking enterprises. And they're some of the best schools in the world. So whether you're thinking about the schools that I mentioned earlier in the independent fee-paying sector, which do an outstanding job, like Eton and St Paul's and Westminster, or if you think about outstanding state schools like Mossbawn Community Academy, which is capable of getting scores, well, it will be scores of children next year, into Cambridge, even though they're from one of the most disadvantaged parts of Hackney. If you look at what the CTCs have done over 20 years, if you look at what the Ark and Harris Academy chains are doing, then I don't believe that you need profit. And in fact, funnily enough, the record of Sir Keith Joseph shows that a combination of a commitment to educational excellence, a belief in philanthropy, and a determination to ensure that you never overlook the talent in any child can actually ensure the highest standards. There are lots of things that business does well, from providing textbooks to providing technology in schools. But I think it's important in education to recognise that the most effective teachers and the most effective heads are those who are driven by a passion for their subject, a love of knowledge, and compassion towards children rather than anything else.
In the back row. Nearly the back row. That's it, yeah.
Hello, my name is David Paul. I'm with a charity which deals with helping people to turn their lives around, it's called Turnaround, because they have problems with literacy or numeracy. The Centre for Policy Studies produced a series of excellent booklets on that, which, as you referred to, are behind a lot of the changes which we've seen recently. And let us all hope that looking forward, this cancer has been eradicated at the source. That, however, leaves millions of people whose lives have so far been blighted by their inability to access any of the information that's available in written form, in electronic form, or which requires some understanding of basic mathematics. And I wondered what initiatives the government has in mind to address this and make these people employable.
You're absolutely right. One of the things that we need to do is to ensure that those people who slip through the net have an opportunity to, through adult education, acquire the levels of literacy and numeracy they need in order to be fully integrated into British life. And one of the things that we are doing, one of the things that the best schools are doing, is making sure that that parents who may not themselves have had the sort of education that enables them to play a full part in society have the chance to join their children at school, sometimes after the main school day, when children are enjoying extracurricular activities. Adults can ensure that their literacy and numeracy is sharpened. But the other thing, of course, we need to recognise is that sometimes it's charities like your own that do a far better job than anyone else can.
We're going to take now the penultimate question, which is over here on the right, in the middle. Have you got him? Yes. Just coming.
Hello, yeah, that's much better. George Guys, member of the CPS. A recently deceased Prime Minister, whose funeral we both attended, once held your portfolio, and she told me that the educational establishment in this country couldn't care less whether the children can read and write as long as they grow up to vote Labour. Now, I saw on the television yesterday a bearded professor of literature denouncing your new PUGS initiative. What is it?
Spelling, punctuation and grammar.
Yeah, spelling, punctuation and grammar, as quite irrelevant and perfectly unimportant, and that the important thing was that the children should express themselves. Now, my question to you is, has that changed at all? Has the Thatcher image of the Department of Education and its inputs changed?
I think the Department, George, thank you for your question, and I think it's important to recognise the Department for Education has changed. I think it had already changed by the time that Keith arrived, which of course was 10 years, almost a day since Margaret Thatcher left. He faced formidable problems then. He was to an extent outnumbered and outgunned, but things were already changing, and they changed subsequently, thanks to brave secretaries of state like Kenneth Baker and Gillian Shepherd and John McGregor, and also thanks to some ministers, even in the last administration, like Andrew Adonis, who were brave and right. So the Department for Education is now actually an engine for reform rather than an obstacle. The civil servants there are pushing ahead with changes that we argued for in opposition and which they're enthusiastic about now that we're in government. We could not have increased the number of academies from 200 to nearly 3,000 in the space of under 3 years unless they were dedicated to making that change. And we would not have been able to have nearly 100 free schools opening in the speed with which they've opened unless there were civil servants who were dedicated to making that change. We couldn't have also set a course for reducing the size of the department, which means that half of its staff will go, unless there was an appetite for reform there. But more than that, you're absolutely right to mention this area of cultural warfare in which we're engaged at the moment. There are people, I don't know who the bearded professor was, there are many great people with beards, King George V. But the one thing that I would say is that there are any number of professors and other academics who are prepared to attack the curriculum that we're putting forward because it embeds a culture of higher standards. And thus it reveals their acquiescence in a culture of low expectations, which would make them hang their heads in shame. Just last week, I delivered a speech to Brighton College, in which I pointed out that teachers of 15 and 16-year-olds were attempting to explain the rise of Hitler in the Weimar Republic by using Mr. Men characters in order to explain who Hitler, Röhm, and Goering were. I also looked at articles in the Journal of the Historical Association which suggested that people understand the significance of George Stephenson, the inventor of the rocket, through the character of Eddie the Teddy. That children, when they were grappling with how to use a museum, should do so through the medium of Finding Nemo. And that children, when they were learning about history, should become history detectives. And that didn't involve any history, it basically involved them playing a role-play version of Cluedo, rather than actually absorbing information. So there are all too many individuals who look as though they might have walked out of the pages of a Richard Littlejohn column, who are responsible for defending a failed status quo. But the fact that you hear about them is because there are diligent researchers in the Department for Education who want to improve the quality of the schooling that our children receive, who bring these abuses to my attention and have played a part in helping to shape the curriculum and the changes to examinations which embed that culture of higher standards. So yes, there is a battle, but the great thing about it is that in the DFE and amongst many head teachers and teachers out there, people want to win that battle. And I know that in the audience here tonight is someone who's been very heavily engaged in that fight, Toby Young, the founder of the West London Free School. I visited his school on Monday. It was a pleasure to be able to walk into a classroom where children were learning the chronology of this country's history, kings and queens, heroes and heroines. It was a delight to go into a class of 11-year-olds and to discover that for poetry they were studying not an ephemeral contemporary poet, but Browning. It's wonderful to see that teachers and people like Toby are fighting that battle, and it's wonderful because the children who will benefit most are the children of poor and disadvantaged families who will never have had access to the best that's been thought and written before, but now have it. And that's something I think in which we can all take pride.
I'm going to, if you will allow me, I'm going to let Michael go. I'm going to exercise the chairman's right to ask the last question, which is this, Michael. Why are the universities in the Department for Business rather than your department?
The reason is that, firstly, Gordon Brown took the universities out of the Department for Education in order to create an extra ministry for John Denham to allow him back into government. The ministry was too small, it didn't punch its weight. So having taken one decision for political interests, he then made another, which is that when he was trying to tempt Peter Mandelson back from Brussels into British politics, he offered him the chance to be the Minister of Business. And Peter Mandelson said, the current department isn't big enough for my intellect, charm, and gubernatorial ability. So Gordon Brown said, well, we'll throw in universities as well in order to sweeten the pill. And we could have changed that when we came into power, but for a variety of reasons to do with coalition building, the judgment was made that the boundaries between Whitehall departments should not alter. I think it's no secret that I think that it's wrong. And I think that you should have one department that looks after the life of the mind and that should be responsible for education from the cradle through to universities. But, nevertheless, we're very, very lucky that the minister who is responsible for universities in that department, David Willits, is the brightest and the saintliest person I know in the current House of Commons.
Michael, thank you. Would you? I'm going to try and attempt to do a joint thank you to the whole of the Joseph family, which is wonderful to see here, and to Michael Gove. Michael has given us a brilliant synthesis of how Keith Joseph's thinking has informed current Conservative policy. And I think we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for all he's doing. I'd like him to know, on behalf of all of us, that the CPS is going to do everything possible that we can to send more power to your elbow. So will you join me for the Josephs and for Michael Gove?